When Sweden and Finland first applied to join NATO in May of last year, most analysts thought that their accession would be a relatively painless process, given their long history of military cooperation with NATO and their cozy relationship with most other member states. Almost immediately then, the vast majority of NATO members set about ratifying their approval, and by the end of September, 28 of NATO's 30 members had given their Nordic neighbours the green light. Today, just two countries are yet to ratify Sweden and Norway's accession: Turkey and Hungary. While Turkey have refused to ratify the Nordic countries for a whole variety of reasons, until very recently, Hungary claimed that they had no issue with Sweden and Finland's accession, and that the only reason they hadn't ratified it yet was because the Hungarian parliament was too busy with legislation related to the EU's rule of law demands. For context, the EU have refused to give Hungary billions of euros in EU funding unless the ruling Fidesz party, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, passes legislation to address issues related to rule of law in Hungary, specifically the independence of the judiciary and LGBTQ+ rights. Now, this argument that Hungary was just too busy to ratify the agreement was always a tad implausible. After all, the Hungarian parliament managed to pass a whole load of other non-EU related legislation in the same time period. But Orban's relative quietude meant that most commentators thought Hungary would eventually ratify the Nordic applicants without any fuss at all. However, perhaps emboldened by Erdogan's success in leveraging his own veto, in the last week or so, Orban and some of his MPs have apparently had second thoughts, and the Hungarian delegation is now going to visit Stockholm and Helsinki to discuss their applications. So in this video, we'll take a look at how Hungary might have overtaken Turkey as the biggest obstacle to NATO's Nordic expansion, what Orban actually wants here, hint, it's probably something to do with the EU's rule of law stuff, and whether he'll actually get it. So, let's get straight into it. The first signs that Hungary might use its NATO veto as leverage came back at the beginning of February, when Hungary's foreign minister paid a visit to Ankara. During his time there, he defended Turkey's refusal to ratify Sweden's NATO bid by saying that Stockholm should act differently if it wanted to secure Ankara's backing. Then, a couple of weeks later, Orban expressed an anxiety about NATO's expansion more generally during his annual State of the Union address. In his speech, Orban said that Europe was drifting towards war and that, quote, "it did not have to happen this way. We could have given a guarantee that we would not admit Ukraine into NATO." Now, it's worth saying that back in 2008, Orban was actually a fervent supporter of admitting not just Ukraine, but also Georgia into NATO, in order to protect them against what he described then as Russian imperialism. But he's apparently changed his mind since then. Anyway, then last week, the head of Fidesz's parliamentary caucus said that a serious debate emerged within Fidesz's parliamentary party over the issue, and certain MPs resented the fact that, quote, "politicians from these countries had insulted Hungary in a crude, unfounded, and often vulgar manner in recent years, and now they're asking for a favour." He then announced that Fidesz would be sending a delegation of MPs to Finland and Sweden to discuss any remaining issues, which is due to arrive sometime around March 9th. Then, on Friday, Orban said that while he was in favour of Swedish and Finnish accession in principle, he said that it's not right for them to ask us to take them on board while they're spreading blatant lies about Hungary, about the rule of law in Hungary, about democracy, about life here. Then, a day later, Orban's chief of staff signalled that ratification, which was originally due to happen before March 9th, might end up taking longer than expected, with the result now expected by the end of March at the earliest. Unsurprisingly, this hasn't gone down all too well with the Nordic aspirants. After the Finnish parliament introduced their NATO accession bill earlier this week, Finland's prime minister told a press conference that Hungary and Turkey's actions strain the credibility of NATO's open door policy. Regardless, the Finnish bill passed by an overwhelming majority on Wednesday, paving the way for Finland to join NATO before their next elections due in April, and crucially, before Sweden, who are yet to fulfill Turkey's demands. So, what's Orban playing at here? Well, he's probably seen how successful Erdogan has been in leveraging his NATO veto, and he's decided to emulate him. While Erdogan's tone might have softened a bit in the past couple of days, and while he might have recently reopened negotiations with Sweden, his hardline bargaining, which some in the West see as blackmail, has undeniably paid dividends. Both Sweden and Finland have taken a stronger stance against Kurdish nationalist groups, and the US has finally agreed to give Turkey their F-16 jets that it withheld after Erdogan bought a Russian S-400 air defense system in 2017. Now, the Turkish foreign minister denied that these two events were related, but they clearly are. Almost immediately after the F-16 deal was announced, Erdogan announced that he'd reopened negotiations with Sweden. So, as we see it, there are three reasons that Orban is holding up Sweden and Finland's accession. Firstly, it plays well to his domestic base. Orban has made his political career out of opposing the EU, and exercising his NATO veto allows him, and by extension Hungary, to look like an important geopolitical player, which goes down well with his nationalist voting bloc. Secondly, it plays well with his foreign friends too. While it might irk America and the EU, legitimizing Turkey's concerns and resisting NATO expansion allows Hungary to curry favor with both Turkey and Russia. For context, Hungary has taken a far softer stance on Russia than many of their European neighbors, and it's clear that Orban imagines Russia and Hungary as having a commercial relationship after the war. Similarly, as the two odd ones out in NATO and Europe, Hungary and Turkey relations have flourished over the last couple of years. Bilateral trade has increased significantly, and the two countries are currently negotiating a brand new military agreement. Thirdly, though, and perhaps most importantly, Orban clearly hopes that by using his NATO veto, he'll be able to extract concessions from the EU on rule of law issues. That's because the EU is currently withholding some 5.8 billion euros worth of grants from the EU's COVID-19 recovery fund. But Orban will be hoping to either force the EU into handing over the money early or at least relaxing their conditions for release. So, will any of this work? Well, it did work for Erdogan, so there is a chance that it will work for Orban too. However, the optics will become significantly more difficult for Orban if Turkey agrees to ratification, because then Hungary will be the only obstacle to Sweden and Finland's accession. And this seems to be at least a possible outcome, especially if Erdogan loses the upcoming elections. Given this, the EU might well decide to call Orban's bluff and just wait him out. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see how this conflict shakes out, and if Sweden and Finland eventually make it into NATO. But this is a worrying clash not only between NATO members, but also within the EU. So if you want to be updated as this whole story plays out, then you should subscribe to the TLDR Daily Briefing. Over there, we break down the biggest news story each day before running you through 3 other stories that you might have missed in the day's chaos. That makes it the quickest and easiest way to stay on top of the news from around the world and make it sound like you know what you're talking about. And because it's from TLDR, you know that the videos will be unbiased and easy to understand. You can find the show every weekday over on the TLDR Daily YouTube channel, or if you prefer, you can listen by searching in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for your support.